You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian ghetto. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in the ghetto. I'm joined today by Montana Classical College, and we're planning on having a discussion on Christianity and vitalism, specifically initiated by a tweet that I had put out. I saw a tweet come across my feed of showed a lifestyle of surfers, windsurfers. There was horses running on the beach. There was a girl in a bikini. Just sort of typical 20-something adventure-seeking, lust for life fun. But what attracted interesting was the heading that said, "This is my ideology," and that kind of sparked something. And so I fired off a tweet, which I didn't say, but Montana has up on his screen. So maybe you can read that for us.
Yeah. So Beach Boy 007 had said, "This is my ideology" above his video. And then you quoted it and said, "What? Catering to self-absorbed, largely indolent, upper middle class kids spending all their time seeking fun. This is our society now. And because of these people, our total fertility rate is plummeting and giving our leadership the excuse they need to replace you with immigrants. Good job."
And then Big Tuna.
Hey, guys.
All right.
Yeah, so you were going to say Montana?
Did you want me to read the second and third? Or just leave that
Sure.
first?
Yeah. No, read the second and third, because I think I went on a little bit more there.
Yeah, so then Wandering Panda had replied, "Yeah, but this video is scratching at it. The same way the poor kid latches onto skateboarding, the infantry working the rankest horse. God, in parentheses, incompletely is found in the gap between control and destruction. There's a form of holiness in saying life is for the living." And your response to this, which sort of followed the initial tweet, was, "Perhaps, but civilizations are built by people who take up duty and responsibility, who are disciplined and purposeful. Youthful fun is all good, but as an ideology, you cannot build or renew a society with it." And then Beach Boy, I think you found another Beach Boy tweet that kind of encapsulated what he was doing, where he said, "Any moment might be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we're doomed. You will never be lovelier than you are now." And then you had said, "I suppose if your outlook is nihilistic, this would be your ideology. Civilizational suicide."
Yeah, because he's got this picture of this guy looking out the window with a gun laying on the bed, right? Mm-hmm. And that's I forget, I think it's that Japanese philosopher, right, who did end up committing seppuku. And I'm trying to remember his name now. Mashima, I think it is.
Yukio Mishima.
Mishima, yeah. And so I think it's probably drawing on something like that, you're living in that intense final moment right before you end it all. And, in some ways, that's the kind of authentic materialist life, right? Where there really is no purpose in life. So you suck the marrow out of what you've got, you live it to the fullest, and then in the end, you authentically honor that, you kill yourself. And that was, and so, if that is exactly, the kind of thing that he's keying off on, and he may not realize all of the implications, because some of this stuff, it's images, people think it's cool. And so, it's fun to tool around with these things. But I was playing off the dichotomy between Kierkegaard's either or, right? So there is the life of the aesthete who is, looking to maximize every feeling, to feel everything deeply, and there's that whole scene of the seducer in either or, where he seduces, I think she's an 18-year-old girl, and he spends at length going on about, how he's enjoying the whole process, and he's getting into, and the whole thing is the emotion, the feeling, the angst, every living into the moment of seducing this young woman, right? And then, you flip to the ethical, where you're in married life, and now you're doing your duty, you're building something, you have wife, children, job, all the rest of these responsibilities. And I know Kierkegaard also then has his religious mode, in which, you pursue the one thing, which is God alone, over and above everything else. But I was drawing that contrast between the two, because I think in many ways, there is, I think, in our society, there's these two modes really. One is, and both are a response to a materialist foundation, or at least, even if, there, as Stephen often will say, that saying you're a materialist is really just a way of masking your true religious commitments. But even so, if you're claiming a kind of materialist worldview, then on the one hand, you have the regime, which has it harnessed the power of the machine to implement utopia through human progress. So this idea that we can engineer utopia through the machine if we are, diligent and careful enough. But when you watch it, what it ends up being is kind of a bland, lifeless. It's brutalism writ large, right? And so you get, in response to that, something that, that a trend in the vitalism to say that no, we as human beings have spirit. They reach back into older mythology and just say, hey, we look, that we can grab hold of these old ideas, these old spirit, and then we can revivify ourselves by grabbing hold of the lust of life. So we can make ourselves beautiful by taking care of our bodies. We can lift, we can eat well, and then we can eschew all of the life of the dutiful, ethical person, family, job, all the rest of it, and we're just going to go out and we're going to conquer. This is, I think, the BAP thing. We're going to be a band of pirates who are out roving around, taking women for ourselves, and upping the F rate, the whole thing. But there is in this thing really, and this is something that Augusto del Noce notes, is that vitalism is a response to a materialist world, in a sense of saying that if there is nothing else but the material, well, what is there then? Well, you then try to grab hold of the fullness of every moment and pack everything into like a lust for life. So you want pleasure, you want to be, you're basically grabbing hold of your own vitality as the center of meaning in life. And so by enhancing this vitality, you then make yourself more, you maximize, who you are as a human being and your own meaning for yourself and so forth. And I basically said, that if you're doing that, you can't at the same time build a civilization, right? So in that sense, now, I think that BAP would argue that he's not really trying to build a civilization, that what he's trying to do is force the contradictions of the current regime to collapse it. And so, okay, fair enough. Maybe that's what you're doing. But, coming from a Christian perspective, Augustine, maybe we can get into that a little bit more because I've been rambling here, looking at the nature of, from an Augustine perspective, as evil as entropic, then anything that works against that entropic nature of evil to corrupt what is good, I think ultimately ends up being a good thing. And so, I don't know necessarily, you can talk about, civilization is the mark of Cain, but in a sense, building human society, building a community, all of these things take effort, they take work, they take discipline, and they take a commitment to a larger purpose, which, a surfer boy lifestyle really doesn't lend itself to. So maybe I'll stop there, maybe because you had some notes things you wanted to say, Montana. Yeah,
no, this is interesting. I mean, so maybe I'll start back at the tweet and then work out.
Sure.
So you have beautiful people surfing, and I wondered if the actions that you see in this 44-second video in some ways, don't necessarily at least strike me as pointing to necessarily a hedonistic lifestyle, in as much as a lot of those people were doing things that I don't know that I could physically do, as far as skiing down a mountain and going off a big jump. Maybe I could go windsurfing. I don't know. It's not obvious to me.
I have done a bunch of those things, so it's they're fun. I was an adrenaline junkie in my younger years.
Sure. So, but it seemed to me that there's even some kind of asceticism that would be required for vitalism. It might be, it obviously, I guess, would be different than Christian asceticism, but a sort of like regime of self-discipline would be required in order to be as beautiful as those people were, and to like take care, to sort of take care of those tasks or do those things. So that's like,
like you're saying, they're just not spontaneously emerging. There's a certain level of commitment and discipline required to just even do what they're doing in the video.
Yeah. And I hear you like on the objecting to saying like, this is my ideology. To sort of take that as a literal statement is kind of crazy, because it seems like it would be radically incomplete. Like, where's God in it? Like, where are the families that produced like the beautiful people, the work that went into that? And, how do you create the living traditions that would shape a small community? So there's like a lot of things that it doesn't have in a way, but I wonder if, to some extent, maybe it's kind of a joke. And I'm not saying that you're insensitive to the fact that it could be a little bit funny, but it seems like he's kind of providing a snapshot or something like that of what it means to be beautiful or powerful or daring, and kind of careless. And it seems to me like it's like an exhortation or a resting vision of what could be, in a way, like the tip of the iceberg, as we were just kind of talking about. And there's one quotation from Bronze Age Mindset. It's near the end in Aphorism 76. But he says this, and maybe Beach Boy had something like this in mind. I'm bored by ideology and by word chopping. The images I post speak for themselves and point to a primal order that is felt by all in a physical sense. So it does seem like a lot of what the vitalists want to do is just like say, hey, look, this is beautiful, and you don't need somebody to tell you it's beautiful. You don't need to read a plaque next to this that will like explain why it's beautiful. You somehow just intuitively sense that that's the case. And it seems like our regime has been asking us to say that ugly things are beautiful. There's like some joke I'm recalling, like, or something is like that giant black woman Lizzo or something, that people will say like, she's so beautiful. And then if you were to tell any woman like, hey, you look like Lizzo, they would be super offended. They would hate that. But they kind of like get tricked by these abstractions or something. Like, I don't know exactly how to say it. I don't know, just like some sort of like egalitarian guilt drags on them, such that they don't really want to allow themselves to say that anything's ugly, or that anything, well, other than, racism is bad. Maybe I'll leave off on that, because I have one other point that I think, because I think part of what you were doing, Kryptos, really drove home a kind of well, I think I can resolve at least one contradiction in vitalism, or an apparent one. But maybe I'll stop rambling and see if you have anything to say to what I said so far before I go to the next step.
Well, I was going to see if BT had anything to say, or you're content to listen for now.
I'm content to listen. I was going to circle back to your Kierkegaard bit later, because I have a C.S. Lewis quote about that, as always.
Okay, there you go. Well, that's good. Yeah, the thought that jumped out at me then is Bap drawing then on trying to pull the metaphysical back into the back door? Like, is he grasping it as saying that we live in, wrapped in a metaphysical world of the forms, and what we're trying to do is to revivify the forms, to grasp at the beautiful again, to grasp at, the heroic again? Because that's in that regard, then, because I think at that point, what you're doing is you're trying to make a specific, like, once you get into the area of metaphysics, you're making a specific, almost religious claim, right? That there is an order in creation, or an order in the universe. Let's, maybe not necessarily frame it in Christian terms that way, but that there's an order in the universe, and we can grasp at it and reveal it again. And this order in the universe is destabilizing the regime. Because the sense that you get from following Bap on Twitter is that, it's not so much that he doesn't have a lot of use for Christianity, but it's more the Christianity as he sees it in the world around him so much, and not necessarily Christianity per se. If I may be reading that correctly.
Oh yeah, I think so. like if you listen to like Caribbean Rhythms, like look at the end of like the William Wheelwright essay, the kind of conversation they have about Christianity there is like pretty interesting. I think Wheelwright has a lot of cool things to say about Christianity. And then, I mean, he had like a bishop on, I think somebody who like thought the SSPX church was like too soft, like somebody who needed to go even more traditional than that, Bishop Williamson. And that was interesting. And I mean, he was unbelievably respectful of him, I would say, even when the bishop was like very clearly kind of saying like, there's no way around being a Christian. You will go to hell if you're not a Christian. And like, you know, vitalism, because you could say like at the deepest fundamental level, vitalism is a kind of prideful self-assertion that like human reason or intuition alone is all that's required in order to live well, and that we don't really need the word of God. Like at the most fundamental level, it seems like there can't be a theoretical synthesis at bottom of Christianity and vitalism, but it seems like there's a lot of practical possibilities. And just like I was just like reading the End of Bronze Age Mindset again to get ready for this, and he's also very clear there that like Christians are like one of the only kind of bastion against the common enemy. And so like you're an idiot if you are kind of going out of your way to insult serious Christians. But I think you're right that he's manifestly harsh with those Christians who've been kind of co-opted by the American civil religion into like turning Christianity into some kind of like disgusting skin suit, which is obviously like people in the Christian.
Well, no, but one of my fundamental critiques is technologizing, right? You know, turning it into a reproducible technology that you can then, you know, institution building as opposed to genuine faith expression, right? One of the things that struck me as we were, you know, in the period between when the tweet hit and today is the, you know, a criminally underread book in Scripture is that of Ecclesiastes, right? And I think one of the things that, because that, you know, where you, I'm trying to find the passage here, where he undertakes, you know, I thought in my heart, this is chapter 2, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good, but that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards and made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and treasure and kings and life and provinces. I acquired men and women singing and harem as well, and the delights of the heart of man. I became greater than far anyone in Jerusalem before me. All this, my wisdom stayed with me. Right? And he continues on, you know, that he even, you know, turned to madness and so forth. And all of it ends up being meaningless. Even some of the stuff that I was talking about, you know, building family and house and pleasure and fun and everything. And he ends up, it's kind of funny. It's almost a sort of small ball version of life. You know, a man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. And this too I see is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat and find enjoyment? And so there is this sense, and he comes back to this, I think, 4 or 5 times throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, that there is a sense of, I hate to say living in the moment, but that when you're doing life, that you just do the simple things, but you do them before God, and then by doing them before God, they fill with meaning in that regard. And it's all of that you lose when you're trying to pursue all these other things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it actually ties in pretty well with what I'd hoped to talk about. So like that is to say, it seems like in Bronze Age Mindset, generally speaking, I don't know if this holds in every passage or they're just like totally coherent, but it almost seems like to me like he's talking to like 2 different audiences at the same time. And maybe not necessarily fully like in a Straussian way, or we don't have to talk about that, but like I guess like somebody like Alcibiades on one hand, or like in a recent Caribbean Rhythms episode, like him talking about wishing some of Bolsonaro's generals in Brazil when it seemed like maybe the election was done dirty. I don't know enough about elections to really know, but like for the sake of argument, let's just say it's possible that one went poorly or something like that. So if you just accept like an if then kind of thing, like if that election was stolen, it would follow that like any general worth their salt should try to do something about that. If like the constitutional framework's been broken by your enemies, then like you should restore order. And he was sort of almost kind of indignant on that episode of like, why didn't one of them like read my book? Or like, why didn't somebody see that like they needed to do this? And it seems like that kind of person, the person who is the man for that moment, is somebody who like maybe doesn't need a kind of fully thought out ideology, or like they don't need some kind of like pamphlet or something. That like if Trump failed to do things as well as he could in the United States, I don't think like reading Plato's Republic more closely or ever at all in his life like would have assisted him. Like he's probably the man that he is in some sense because he's not that learned. That's just not the type of person that he is. But he has a kind of charisma and impetuosity, and in some cases courage, that I think not that many people possess. So I think on one hand, the book is addressed to that type of person or to somebody much better than Trump, and that those would be the kind of people who should ignore their families, should be directed totally outside of the domestic sphere, and who might have to do, I don't know, sort of incredible things in order to break open the iron prisons so that like there's less suffocation and more freedom or something like that. But then the other audience would be like me. I'll just not speak for anybody else and just like say me. I'm so far away from Alcibiades, it's not even close. And near the end of the book, he also talks about starting scouting organizations, doing things like at the local level, like getting involved in like city government, making it so that your particular area is like as free as it can be. And I think like some of the piratical stuff, I don't think he really thinks, I don't know that most people are that serious about it. Most people aren't well equipped. Like just because you're lifting doesn't mean that you're ready to be part of a piratical brotherhood. Like that's a huge step, obviously. But so I don't know. So I just wonder if you look at the book from that frame of reference, I think that in a way he's like, well, yeah, you probably should. If you have a family, you should be good to them. You should care about them. But if you are a man of like high vision and sort of like talents that are unusual, maybe you would be better off. I guess, what's the best way to put it? I don't know, dispersing like your power elsewhere, that it should be directed in a different kind of way, I suppose. I think that resolves like a lot of things as far as like, yeah, what kind of guidance should you take from the book? Because I'm not Alcibiades, so I think a lot of his suggestions aren't for me.
Well, it's interesting because there is, just as you were talking there, Montana, there is a Christian analogous Christian sort of frame, because Paul, in talking about whether someone should or shouldn't get married, he was living with the urgency that Christ is going to come back at any time, right? And that's the thing. And so he says, well, if you are content not to get married, so let's say you're engaged to a woman, you haven't consummated the marriage, and you're content that you don't need to be married, well, then you're better to commit yourself to Christ, because once you get married, your interests will be divided, right? You'll be divided between Christ and between the needs of your wife. And so there is something to that sense where, the great man, maybe being called, should set behind some of those usual things, but, within a Christian frame, then you're also setting behind, leaving a patrimony for yourself and those types of things as well too, right? If you're going to do it, quote unquote, properly and ethically. So there is that sense of seizing the moment, and like I look, God gives us a series of gifts. He gives us a series of talents. And, I think a lot of us feel acutely this sense that being enframed in a technological world squanders much of the energy of our life. I run, I fish, I like to get out into the bush and just do those types of things because it is good to get away. That's sort of my, piratical act, is just to get out into the bush and leave my phone, get away far enough away from that there's no cell towers near enough that I can pick up a signal, even if I want to, that the phone sort of is just dead. And it's basically useful as a camera to take pictures of fish when you've caught them. Right. So I guess for me, it's that sense of and maybe it's teleological, is a sense of to what end is your life directed, right? Like why, the question is why are you trying to enhance yourself in your body? Is it I guess from a Christian perspective, any end that is lower than being directed for the purposes of God and so forth is secondary, right? Now that seems like, that's high religious vision, but as the book of Ecclesiastes is saying too, that you don't have to build palaces and conquer kingdoms to be properly oriented in your life. And a lot of us are not properly oriented in our lives because we don't eat and drink and do our work mindful of the fact that we're doing them before the Creator.
I think it's interesting that you bring up. I think it's interesting that you bring up Paul and the "Don't Marry" section, because one, I think that's one of the only places in all of Paul's letters where he kind of like not prefaces it, but at the end he kind of like gives a caveat, which is like, now I think that I have the Spirit when I say these things, which is
he does that in one other place that's similar, where he says, I don't have a specific word from the Lord, but as one who is trustworthy, this is what I say to you. But you're right, yeah. And
then so that's just an interesting caveat. But also we can go straight to Christ. And Christ says in the Gospels, whoever does not hate his father, mother, sister, and brother is not worthy to be called my disciple. And, the understanding in the church tradition that I'm from is not, does God actually want you to hate your family? No, but it means that if there are temporal loves that obscure the eternal love, then those loves are not only not good, they're like you're in sin. And so it's interesting to compare the vitalist perspective, because sometimes paganism rhymes with the truth. It's not the truth, but it rhymes. And it's like, also the additional fact is that God can anoint pagans to do things when his people, either the Jews in the Old Testament or the church now, wouldn't do. And there's perfect examples of this over and over again, like Nebuchadnezzar being anointed by God, and he gets arrogant and thinks it's his own power, and God strikes him down. Later, God uses Cyrus the Great to have the temple rebuilt. And so there are themes in the Bible that suggest we can be okay with taking cues from pagans occasionally. Like he says, when Jesus is being paraded in on a donkey in Jerusalem, and the Pharisees say to him, they hear everyone calling him Lord, and laying down the palm branches at the feet of his donkey as he walks in. And the Pharisees say, hey, do you not hear your disciples? They're blaspheming. Stop them. Do something to stop them from blaspheming the name of God. And then Jesus says, I tell you that if they would not cry out for me, the rocks would cry out. And sometimes the rocks are used symbolically to represent pagans. So
there is this is an analogy that one of my philosophy profs at a Christian university used with me, or with us, I guess, is he talked about the treasures of the Egyptians, right? As the Israelites fled Egypt, the Egyptians, God caused the Egyptians to heap them up full of treasures on the way out the door, right? Well, there was two uses put for those treasures. The first was they made a calf, so idolatry. And the second, it was, the second use is that it was turned into the items for the tabernacle, right? So you have these two, in a sense, two uses of what, and so he talked about this idea of the treasures of the Egyptians, is that, you're not really looking at it. What's the way to put it? I know the Catholics have a similar idea that, the truth is very close as it comes. The closer you are to Christ and the church, the closer you are to the purity of the truth. And as you go out from those rings, the truth is still there, but it becomes more clouded, more twisted, more distorted as you go forward, right? So, and this is one of the things that I've always appreciated in very smart non-Christians, is that there's often a lot of things you can learn. And this is why somebody like Bap, who's respectful, of the Christian faith and not a quote unquote a mocker, and who's smart is often worth paying attention to, even if in the end, like I look at it and say like, hey, you have to ultimately, I guess you can learn from it, but in the end you have to ultimately reject the overall, like this is not going to save you, so to speak, right? So, you can learn from things even like Feuerbach or Freud or many of these, atheist Eastern religions that you can learn from, but you have to realize that these treasures of the Egyptians, that they can lead you to idolatry, but they can also be refined and, and then because the truth has being and the lies are basically twistings of the truth, right? So if you can disentangle the lie, Satan, when he lies, likes to use scripture, right? So it's oftentimes he's using the words and quoting them directly, but then framing them in a way that, inverts them and turns them against God. So I guess that's part of the whole thing of ideas. So like, what do you do with it? Like, don't necessarily be afraid of these things, but in the end, as long as you understand your Christian faith, you can borrow and use them, but you probably don't want to become a quote unquote hardcore Baptist per se.
I wonder, like two related points to some of the things you brought up. I think especially at the beginning, like the question that you and Tuna both brought up about, hating your mother and father, but not really hating them, but just being sensitive to when temporal loyalties or concerns draw you away from like the thing which is most needful. Is it like, I don't like in Plato's Laches, it's like a conversation where Socrates talks to two fathers, and these two fathers, their fathers were awesome generals. Like they were highly successful, but they were out on campaign for most of the children's lives. And so that makes it so that they didn't really amount to much. And they kind of feel this deep disappointment and shame at kind of being in the shadow of their fathers and not really knowing what to do about it. But then the thing that they think, okay, well, if we can't be great, what's available to us? Well, we can try to help our sons become great. So they seek out two generals in the city to ask them, what kind of things that their sons should learn in order to become most excellent. And then eventually start to see Socrates as maybe a better guide as far as that's concerned. But that seems to present like this tragic difficulty of sometimes, I don't know, I guess like your city being in need. And so a man having to go out away from domestic matters out there into the wild in a sense and not being able to be a good father. And then it's precisely that action that makes it so that their children might be bad. Or this could also be kind of like an Odyssean problem. Now Telemachus maybe ultimately turns out to be okay, but it's not through Odysseus's doing. He can't be an equally good father and an equally good adventurer, an equally good father and an equally good soldier. Like that there's just like sort of like trade-offs in terms of excellence. And so I'm curious. So the first question is like how to think about handling those things when it comes to being as excellent as possible for your community or something like that versus attending to your familial duties on. So that would be the first question. And then the second question is, I'm kind of curious if so you could say that vitalists at bottom or at root in a way are atheists in a sense. I think Bab's metaphysics there's a lot to say about that, I suppose. Like maybe he thinks that like everything is mysterious, that there's a kind of Heraclitean fire that's like at the center of everything. And in that sense, like, I don't know, like there's a lot of mystery and anything could come to be. And progressives, I guess you could say, certainly most of the time are atheists, either in their own self-belief or functionally, I guess. But I wonder if like vitalists converting will be much, much better or more interesting church members than a progressive who comes in. I don't know. At least all the Christians.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I would definitely think so.
And I think precisely because they're a little bit, although maybe you disagree, but a little bit freer. Well, maybe in many cases, a lot freer from regime pieties that would like prevent you from being a good Christian. I guess the main reason that I am highly interested in Bab's thought is because when I read Bronze Age Mindset for the first time, I thought that I was pretty free from regime pieties. I thought I was like free from a lot of egalitarian concerns. And reading it, I was like, whoa, I'm not. My mind is not as free as I thought it was. And any book that could help me realize that my mind was less liberated than I thought it was is just like, I owe like a debt of gratitude that like reopened like a lot of questions and things. So that's like
I have read I've read books like that too. It's but as you're talking, there's a couple things that just popped in mind. One is the sort of the combination of like Paul Ricoeur, one self is another, that you can't know yourself as yourself. You know yourself as mirrored back to you by somebody else who sees you from the outside, right? And so there's that. But then there's also, I think it's Ortega y Gasset, who argues that the philosopher never really belongs to his own community. So part of the role of the philosopher is to stand outside, so to have a foot in and a foot out of the community. So he has a foot in so that he, in some sense, belongs, but he has the foot out in a sense that he has to stand outside the community and observe it, and then report back to the community. So we were like, this comparison was given to us in pastoral training, that you will never truly be part of the community, because if you have a foot in, you also have a foot out, because you've got to watch them and tell them about themselves, the things that they can't see in themselves, right? So there is this value in somebody who comes from outside of you. You often get this thing on Twitter, like, well, how can you tell us what it means to be an American? You're not from here. And it's like, okay, but I hate to tell you this, but I can see some things about you that you can't see some things about yourselves, because you're too close to yourself, that you just don't see yourself at all, right? And I think that goes with anybody, right? So there is this sense where there is, and the other thought I had sort of relates to the two major formulations of our relation to being, one being Plato and hierarchy and forms, and then the other being Heidegger, right? And so the notion of, like, you'd say, like the general, right? So that general, in relating to the forms, has two archetypes that he could be embracing. So the question you would have to ask, say, from a Christian perspective, is, that, like, I'm not of the mind that, God has a special plan for me, right? That I'm more of the John 5:19. God is at work, and you watch him, and then you join in his work, right? So I'm more of the mind that there's a static world hierarchy of being, and you realize yourself by embracing the archetypes that God lays in front of you, right? So you have to ask, what is the archetype that God is asking me to step into and to embrace? So now you might have different modes at different times, and you might realize, and you realize, and this is a thing that Eliade talks about, right? That you realize yourself by living into the archetypes. And this is how the pre-modern person found himself, as he lived into the archetypes, and he then becomes, in part, the person in the story. So the great general then becomes who he is by living into the story. But the sacrifice that he has to make is that he cannot live fully into the archetype of the father. So the question is, at what point can you embrace both archetypes, or do you have to, and fundamentally, is your telos, your end, the great general, and the price that you have to pay, the sacrifice you have to make is, you sacrifice your children for being the general. It's a kind of harsh way to say it, right? You sacrificed the well-being of your sons to be the great general. And then you wonder, so now which archetype then is most important? Civilization. I mean, in that tweet, I made the thing too, like, well, okay, what's most needful then is, you see another thing, when our total fertility rate is under the, reproduction, and our society seems to be dying, that maybe in this moment, we don't need generals. We need fathers and mothers and families. So, and that is at the moment, I think was the argument that I was making, is that perhaps at this moment, the archetype that sits in front of us is the Kierkegaardian archetype of, the Kierkegaardian moment of doing our duty, of embracing the role of father, embracing the role of mother, and raising your children, and establishing communities, because that's what's falling out around us. I mean, maybe we need generals, and maybe somebody will be called into that role, but I wonder if the bulk of us are open into a different role. And that flips in there, I guess, the contrast to the Heideggerian mode, which there's a lot of truth in what Heidegger is saying, but we carry it to excess in that sense, is that where the only thing that matters is authenticity. In that sense, there is no, because if you combine it to a nominalist world that is functionally materialist, then there's no archetypes, there's nothing out there. But yet Heidegger tells me I have to, in order to find meaning, I have to throw myself onto the horizon of time. And so I have to, there's an inner person that needs to get out and needs to be thrown on the horizon of time. And so whether that inner person, if I feel like I'm a man, but I'm in a body of a woman, I need to throw that, and I need to be authentic to myself. And so we live in this culture where, and this is the thing that Marcia Eliade talked about as the burden of history lays upon you. So you've got to, find yourself. What does my life mean? I've got to, who am I? And we've got this whole, whereas prior to that modern period, prior to this burden of history being placed upon you, your life was largely presented to you. You were a farmer, you were a craftsman, you were the king, and you became who you were by fitting into the archetype as it was presented to you, if that makes sense. So I guess for me, that's that kind of, and that's, I think, somewhat of the worldview that I think that I want to have people consider in that sense, is like, we've taken this notion of being authentic, of living on the edge, that lust for life, that you have to just, every experience has to be dramatic and full. And, in that sense, Kierkegaard's aesthete, right? And that's kind of what we've modeled. So I have to throw myself onto the horizon of time. And I'm like, no, maybe there are archetypes that need to present yourself that, maybe what is really needful for you is to realize that the archetype that God has laid in front of you is to be a husband, a father. Now, I know people, like Bap would probably criticize you. You're a wage slave supporting the system, going in and working in your cubicle and blah, 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 blah. Now, there might be other options other than that to support your family and your thing. But I wonder if there is this re-embracing of just fulfillment in fitting the archetype. You're a woman, you have a womb, embrace the archetype of mother, that type of thing.
Yeah. Brian, the second part of your question there, like you were kind of talking about vitalists and whether they're really atheists or potential converts. C.S. Lewis openly wondered in a couple private letters, and I believe maybe it was in the Abolition of Man, but he openly wondered whether we would need to re-paganize people before we would re-Christianize them. In other words, the things that motivate the pagan a lot of the time are just twisted versions of the good thing. And in the Screwtape letters, not to harp on Lewis too much, but that's like my area of expertise. But in the Screwtape letters, Screwtape is writing to Wormwood, and Screwtape says to him when advised, because Wormwood's like, oh, I'm going to do this to tempt my subject, my person that I'm tempting. And Screwtape warns him and says, don't tempt him too much with pleasure, because we didn't make the pleasures. The pleasures are the creation of our enemy. And since it's, the devil is talking, pleasure is a creation of God, which is the insinuation there. Like, and all the pleasures are. And even the worst pleasures are just a broken version of the original good pleasure that and the pleasures that are eternal. And so, the vitalists, I think, kind of following Brian, I think they'd actually, they are easier to evangelize to than progressives, because progressives have actually adopted the enemy religion of Christianity. They've adopted kind of an inversion of it where, we love, but we don't love a particular, like, I think it's Dostoevsky who says, oh, you love the poor. Like, show me where they are, basically. Like, the poor, the homeless, people, society, humanity. Progressives don't, and then they turn around and
they're abstractions.
Yes, they love abstractions, and they turn around and treat the people in their life like crap and have filthy mouths and cuss all the time. And there's, so just on that note, like, I think, yeah, this is fertile ground for Christians to evangelize to. And so we should treat these arguments, even if they're presented in sort of the silly style that Bap does them, we should treat them really seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tune is kind of funny. Like when I was talking to my lifting buddy, who's like a SSPX Catholic, he basically, I think your comment now and the comment earlier about Cyrus the Great, Nebuchadnezzar, he literally, when I was like telling him I was going to, talk to some people about this, he was like, you have to say those things. And then you said them. So
well, good. Great minds, as they say. Of course,
yes.
that reflects better on me than it does on you because I'm coming up to your level.
Oh, that's right. There you go. Don't.
Yeah. So it seems like.
Go ahead, Monty.
Oh no, go ahead.
I'd lost my train of thought, so as soon as we interrupt each other, just
vaporized.
Yeah. Well, so then, maybe this will tie back. Okay, yeah. So it seems like vitalism maybe is more productive of better psychic soil for converts and more salutary political effects. Like, not that, well, I don't know. It's kind of stupid to talk about like if Christians or vitalists were in charge of the American regime, because I don't know. Like it's hard to think about it at that level, and maybe it's not helpful. But it seems to me that like a vitalist regime, if such a thing could even be, if there's like some, I don't know. It seems like Bap thinks of like a military dictatorship, since he sees that as being a more honest form of governance, insofar as it's sort of saying like, look, politics is kind of like about persuasion and force is like at the bottom of this. Like if you need eventually perhaps to coerce people to do things, and like that's what stands behind law, is the capacity for coercion. I mean, hopefully people just do good things, but a lot of times they don't. And well, so then to tie this background to something Kryptos was saying a little bit, although maybe hopefully this doesn't go too far afield, but
no.
I've been reading some like romantic poetry recently, and I kind of despise reading lyric poetry, but I started to like it in light of some things that Camille Paglia was saying, like in her book, Burn, Break, Blow. Never mind. I'm not going to attack Tolkien, but like, I got more out of 3 pages of Paglia's interpretation of a Wordsworth poem than I did out of like Tolkien's commentary on Beowulf. This is probably a me problem. This is a skill problem. This is not Tolkien's fault. And maybe that book wasn't even meant to be published. His son just published it. So that should not be okay. But it seemed like Paglia kind of like sets out a kind of thing of like, so the Romantic sees the modern world as suffocating in some sense because of things, that Kryptos could probably speak better to than I can, with respect to technique and technology being a big part of what's suffocating our lives. And then there's like this sudden like longing for a way out, like some kind of ideal past or some kind of place that never really was quite as good as you think that it is, as you're thinking about it. Like you just imagine like, well, it must have been perfect in Sparta. Like I would have been totally at home there in every respect, even though like we'd probably all, poop our pants if we were in Sparta and, we died like really quickly, but whatever. So you imagine this ideal place, but then you're like, oh, I can't get there. And so it like then gets sublimated into something like a longing to just destroy everything that is, or it becomes something like the safer version in a way, is something like emotional authenticity. And so like, I don't know how much romantic authenticity is ultimately compatible with or in full agreement with Heideggerian authenticity. I haven't read Heidegger in a while, so I can't speak to that, but something like the emotions are like the core of what a human being is, and sort of letting your reason go, because that's probably what society told you. That's what at least the romantic poet would say, whereas like your emotions can't be faked, and so somehow they're supposed to be a better guide. And that's kind of like a naive view that forgets that probably your emotions are modulated by the regime. Like the fact that you feel angry about certain things and not angry, those may not be very authentic reactions. Those very well could be conditioned. So there's a lot to say about that. So maybe I'll step off and see what you guys have to say about this.
The question is interesting in that this notion of, like, as Heidegger talks, I think Heidegger's key insight into technology, excuse me, and one that Ellul picks up on different ways, is this notion of enframing. And I'm writing a piece right now that's been a little bit about like pulling teeth, but where this notion of technology completely enframes us. And so that, for example, the way that Ellul describes, so when you use a tool, a hand tool, for example, and you're making something, you're using a tool. So it's a machine kind of thing. It's technique, but it's often organic technique. It's embedded, and it's often learned through apprenticeship, this sort of thing. And then, but you have a feel for the material, for the wood, the knowledge is internal. And then you begin to take steps away from that, right? So maybe you get power tools, or then you have a machine that does most of the work for you. You just basically, you're handling the material, but all you're doing is feeding it into the machine. And then the next step of abstraction is you're sitting in a room, looking through a window or with cameras, and you're watching the materials being fed in automatically, and you're just, working on a monitor. And so you're making things, quote unquote, but your relationship to the material is completely abstract. And I think that the modern era has done this in our relationship to God. And this is the point that Ian McGilchrist made, in The Master and the Emissary, was that by focusing on the rational, the technical, scientific, that we've actually let go of the intuitive side of our brain, and it is kind of withered. That's the Julian Jaynes argument in the bicameral mind, is that as we've become more rational, more technologized, as we've embraced, the linear thinking of the printed text and so forth, is that the price that you pay is that you're no longer able to intuit the divine or the metaphysical. That ability actually withers. And so you can no longer you can no longer contact God because you have technical power. And that was Julian Jaynes' thesis in the bicameral mind. And I think, Walter Ong in Orality and Literacy and the Presence of the Word does something very similar, not quite as extreme, but he monitors the changes between orality and literacy, and how your understanding of history moves from when you have to remember it all the time in song to being able to write it down. Plato notes these differences. It's been a while since where he talks about the corrupting influence of the written text on your ability to remember the stories and the poems and so forth, right? So even they were seeing these changes in 400 BC as writing began to become more prevalent among the elite classes, that it was changing how they think. So then you progress it forward and you bring in something like the printing press and all of these other changes. And now you arrive in a technical society where you're completely inframed. So then, how do you break out, I guess is the question. And so, Augusto del Noce, and you really have to thank Carlo Lancelotti for doing the translation work and introducing del Noce to English audiences. But in The Crisis of Modernity, del Noce, and also the new one that I'm reading, he notes two basic orientations, right? He says both fascism and, in a sense, Marxist liberalism, capitalism are on two sides. Both are essentially materialists, and both operate in a post-Nietzschean God is dead kind of world, right? And so and the nice thing about Del Noce is he takes fascism seriously as a school of thought, right? And so he argues that these two modes of thinking are essentially the same, right? So he says what they want to do is sweep away the present order to grasp at a utopia. So that's, in a sense, you smash apart the modern frame, this inframing that you're in, and then the one tries to build utopia through a future utopia that is yet to come. So once we sweep away the present, then, as Marx says, then the present or the future can emerge. We don't know what it's going to be yet, but we have to sweep away the present order, and then that will allow it to emerge, right? So that's that future utopia. Progressivism is building towards that. The market economy is also, in a sense, future utopian. If we just let the market play out, everybody will be wealthy and utopia will result, right? So it's a future utopia to view. On the other hand, you have fascism, which says that no, there was an ideal time in the past that must be recovered. So, but we still need to sweep away the present order, and then we can then recover this past. Now, what Del Noce argues, he says that when the fascist is trying to recover myth and mythos, he's not recovering it authentically because those myths are essentially dead. He's recovering them in a post-Nietzschean world. So in a world where God is already dead, right? So, and this is, I guess, the essential, and this is in Carlo Lancelotti, and commenting on Del Noce's work, in one of the videos makes this point in regards to vitalism, that he says vitalism falls into this camp in a sense of trying to reinvigorate these old mythologies that are technically dead, that they have no connection to. And so you have this kind of, in that sense, it's a materialist worldview that tends to break out of the current frame, to sweep away the present order, to attack it with, with beauty and with the, the pirate lifestyle or whatever. So you sweep away the present order, and then you reestablish the power of these old Greek myths, right? So he says these are your basically two arts. Now, on the one hand, just to be, you have to really say, Protestantism falls actually into that camp of an early, kind of a proto-fascism, in a sense that it's a past utopianism. So it wants to sweep away the current corrupt order and then re-invivify the original apostolic order, which is what the pretense of what it was being done, right? So we're going to recover the original apostolic order in the present. So now, what Del Noce argues then as a Catholic is that to break free from both of these, he says you have to look for living tradition. And he says, where do you find living tradition? Is in the living tradition of the church. Now, he goes so far as to talk about an ontologism, and I think he's correct in this. And this comes down to this when you're talking about, BAP trying to break through the framework and recover some of this vitality and so forth. What Del Noce says is that ultimately we revivify things in the encounter with the divine in the present. So Kant would argue that this encounter is closed off to you, that there's no rational content there in this encounter. And what Del Noce argued is that, yes, in this encounter with the divine, in the present, in frame or within tradition, within a living tradition, so it's not like recovering something dead from the past. So in this living tradition, you meet God, and in this meeting with God, there is real content that can then be unfolded, opened up. In a sense, it revivifies, life as a community that way. And I think he's fundamentally right that and this is, I think, something that you were talking about earlier, Montana, in terms of, how do we then, revivify our society, our culture. And I think this is in the end what Del Noce turns to, is in a sense of rejection of both of the major sort of post-Nietzschean streams that we live in within our society. Mm-hmm. So it ultimately becomes a mystical journey, in a sense that the way forward, or the way to break the deadlock, the Gordian knot between fascism and Marxism, or fascism and liberalism, is to encounter God within the living tradition of the church directly, like the direct mystical encounter with God. And I think he's fundamentally correct.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, so I don't know. Well, there's a lot to say. So maybe
and it's probably the first time you hear something, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if Dugan was reading Del Noce because he more or less, seems to say that liberalism, communism, and fascism are all fundamentally similar in as much as they're all ineluctably modern, and in some sense, like all kind of are somewhat progressive, even if fascism wants to rely on some like mythos from the past as sort of, I don't know, sucking it in and trying to combine it with something else. And I remember I was listening to this podcast, I think it's called Getting Ready for Rome, by this like old retired Straussian. That's pretty interesting, but he had a session on Mussolini, or several sessions on Mussolini, but that Mussolini, in order to make it so that some of the like more impressive buildings, he wanted to make some of the more impressive buildings visible from farther away than they would have been in Rome. And so like a lot of buildings got cleared away by Ambler's account. And he thought that this was like a big mistake or kind of misunderstanding of the classical intent, which was that you should walk through these winding streets and you don't even know that you're about to encounter this kind of big, majestic building. And then when you do, it kind of pops out almost like it's something divine. And that by like making somehow the gods totally present, you know, to use the metaphor here, and always perceptible from like almost any distance, it kind of makes it like less mysterious or less powerful when you encounter it, because I don't know, some kind of like contempt for familiarity or something.
It's like breaking the metaphor or explaining the joke.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder if Dugan was looking. I guess that's like two different things.
I unfortunately have not. You know, there's only so many things that you can read in so much time. But Dugan is one that I've thought, oh, should I? Shouldn't I? And I've just, one of these days I'm going to have to dive in and read some Dugan, because he does seem different but interesting. You were going to say, Tim?
Oren McIntyre did a 5 or 6 part series with Michael Millerman on Dugan's book that came out. So
I did listen to that, that was part of what got me thinking, because Millerman is quite good, actually.
Yes.
On Dugan.
Yeah, the only online school that's better than Montana Classical College is Millerman School. I hope to overcome him someday, but right now it would just be a lie to say that our offerings are more complete or better than his right now. So I like Millerman a lot.
Yeah, Millerman's good that way. It's, you know, and I think this is kind of the thing too, you know. It's good that we have. I like writing Substack. I like these long form conversations. And Twitter. The thing about Twitter that's interesting. It's similar to preaching in some ways, where you know, you have 20 minutes up on the pulpit, and you know, people often see you. I get done preaching, and people will say, well, you didn't say this, you didn't say that, you know, why didn't you tell them about this? Now, there's this other passage here that would moderate what you're saying, you know, there or whatever. And I said, yeah, but I wasn't preaching on those passages. So a lot of times is we're going to take this passage, we're going to paint it with a big brush, and we're going to focus on this one thing, and we're going to get in, get out, and we're going to, in that sense, enlarge it for you without nuance. And in some ways, Twitter is really good for that, because you're forced to use, you know, 240 characters, or you know, like me, often do these like effort threads, but nobody looks at the second or third or 10th or 20th tweet unless the first one hits, right? And so the idea is that you pierce something, and you hit on something, and you without nuance, and you turn up the volume, and you poke, right? And that's often, you know, where your most, at least for me anyways, my most successful tweets are. And of course, once you poke a bear, of course, everybody just starts to set their hair on fire and run around in circles and has fun that way. But it serves a purpose, I think, that way too, when you can say things like, okay, for example, like the young man, I think it's a young man who put his tweet out, you know, this is my ideology. Well, it poked me, right? So I poked back, right? And so I think there is something to that, that poking that can occur in Twitter, where you can, the force of an economy of language forces you to take an idea and completely isolate it without any nuance and just hammer it, bam. And then it has that effect of smashing something, and then you have all the pieces laying around, and now you just watch everybody try to pick everything up. And I think, you know, like as you get into somebody like that, there's a lot of depth to it as well. And even in the vitalist movement, there's a lot of depth. I remember now the one thing that I was going to talk about. I think we should probably not leave here without at least, and if you guys have to go, that's fine. But I think you fold in, vitalism is much, much easier to deal with, as long as we're talking about working out eating well, the lust for life, as long as that, in my regard, is put under the hierarchy of being properly oriented with a proper telos, where it's the idea is that it's subordinated to the pursuit of union with God. That's wonderful, right? Your body should. I mean, if you don't get enough sleep, it's going to be very hard to pray. If you're unhealthy, it's going to be very, very hard to pray. If you eat poorly, it's going to be hard to pray. All of these other things, right? If you're physically not fit, it gets much harder to pray, right? So these types of things. So from a Christian perspective, there's a lot of value in these vitalist lessons to say you should be lifting, you should be running, you should, or whatever, and being active. You should eat well, because the stuff that's going into your foods is killing you as a person. The microplastics, the hormones, all the rest of it, right? The seed oils are just destroying your health. And, you should be getting a good night's rest every night. These types of things. God and Sabbath are a thing. So there is that. But the one piece that I think really, at least in the Bible, is this notion of violence, right? So Christianity is looked at as quote unquote feminine. And so the amp up is that really Christianity has to be rejected because it doesn't embrace the violent side of life. And now I have written at length on this notion, but I think this is the one area where people are said to say, well, Christians are all a bunch of pansies, and they want to be pushovers, turn the other cheek, and just get mowed under and fed to the lions, right? And in this regard, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the faith. But I don't know whether you have any thoughts about this, Montana, or not. But I think that this aspect is one of these things when you talk about vitalism that you have to deal with is this, the warrior figure, Mars, the god Mars, and so forth. Pursuing that type of, the bloodlust and violence is essential to us as men, and you need to grasp it and fill yourself full of it, that type of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot to say. I mean, so I won't claim to speak exactly for what I think that Bab would say about this kind of thing, and maybe just a kind of general statement about vitalism. Well, maybe he would agree with this. I don't know. But it seems like it's highly circumstantial, just in the sense that there's no categorical imperatives of vitalism. I mean, it seems like getting strong and beautiful is the closest it gets to having some sort of rules of no, you should always try to do something along those lines. You should be at least capable of danger. But I mean, at least in, various vitalist group chats and things like that, I think there's a very clear, I don't know, kind of when people come into the chats and say we need to do something, and they start fed posting or something like that.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a very quick, to get this person out of here. This is not, I don't know. So it's a kind of interesting relationship with violence in that, there's figures that are talked about in the third part of Bronze Age mindset that where Bab praises their carelessness, that they don't look around and see a bunch of oh, these beings don't have dignity. They're just they could be swept away or something. So in that sense, it's there are passages where it's whoa, this purifying fire would kill a lot of ensouled beings, and that seems kind of terrifying. I don't want the zoos to be open. I don't want to fight against the lion right now. Maybe ever, but it's not. But so it is weird to see the interplay that on one hand, somehow under the right circumstances from the vitalist perspective, violence is good. But at least under our current circumstances, anything I've ever seen BAP or any vitalist that I take seriously say has been, at the local level, you should not be starting fights. I mean, you should be able to defend yourself and things like that. And then at the international level, it seems like the vitalists, and he talks about this even in Bronze Age mindset, should be highly interested in non-interference. The U.S. should not be a part of forever wars. This is a giant mistake. And it seems if to the extent that vitalism has played a role in shaping some of the America first kind of things, it seems it's pushed them towards no, we should not be in these wars. We don't really have a good reason to fight a war. We don't even have at this stage a very good military to fight the wars. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but the know-how and the physical capital of the military and the COVID purges more or less of a lot of patriotic guys with them all having to get the jab or whatever. So I don't know. Maybe that's not a great answer to it, but it does seem anything I've seen him say is in the present moment, violence would be a gigantic mistake. at the same time that you should prepare yourself should some sort of like crucial moment emerge. But I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question very well or not.
I think
you had something to say too?
Yeah, I think violence, like, I'm not the expert on the vitalist side, but it seems like when the violence is okay, because really everyone has a set of ideals of when violence is okay and when it's not. I mean, progressives are pretty upfront about this. We have the whole border thing going on right now, and there's all the General Sherman posting, which, first of all, he wouldn't like you, so stop. But also, like, everyone has the circumstances where they think violence is okay. And even Christians, have different Christian traditions have had different particular interpretations of when violence has been okay. There have been pacifist Christians. They're actually in the minority. There's been Christians like, and obviously their legacy is debatable or whatever, but like Constantine the Great. But to me, when you're looking at the vitalist interpretation of it, it feels like it's really tied really closely with glory. And so,
yes,
like when you look at Julius Caesar, when he was stabbed in the Roman Senate, this is, it's a small detail, so people leave it out because it's really about Brutus's betrayal and Caesar's tragic death and everything like that. But everyone forgets that Caesar was about to go on a military campaign, and he was 55 or 56 when he was about to embark on this military campaign, and he didn't need to go. He had already consolidated what was in the empire. But a lot of people, not a lot, but some historians speculate that the reason he wanted to go on this last expedition, I think it was going to be to Parthia, perhaps, maybe. Mm-hmm. But the reason he wanted to go on this last expedition is because he wanted to die in battle and in glory and fighting for Rome. And, it would make him an eternal hero of the empire, which, Augustus did that for him after the fact. But that was how he wanted to die. He obviously didn't want to die as a tragic figure in his own toga and his own blood in the Senate floor. So maybe that's like a historical precedent we could look at for like when violence is okay from the vitalist lens. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, MTC.
Well, so I mean, yeah, like for me, I mean, I come at it purely from a Christian perspective, right? So you frame violence, first of all, there's the personal side of it, right? Which is the call to the general call to nonviolence. And I think we frame this within the larger frame of God's intent for the universe. So when we were placed in the garden, there is this sense that violence really wasn't what God intended for his creatures, for humanity. And so the fall into sin, then, what happens right next, brother against brother, there's resentment, and one kills the other, and then, his blood is crying out for the other. So there is this sense immediately, like the first thing that happens after the garden, resentment leads to murder, and God is unhappy with this, right? And then but we live in a world of sin, and there is this recognition that there are different roles. So me as a general person is in a different place than, we might say, the role of the king, who is entrusted by God to wield the sword on behalf of maintaining order in society. So there's a role of violence, sort of an official role of violence in, as like that Romans 13, of punishing the wrongdoer, right? So of maintaining justice, punishing the wrongdoer, but also then of defending the people. So now in the Protestant tradition, we have this thing, everybody is, prophet, priest, and king. The archetypes exist there for everybody, right? So somebody breaks into your house and you defend your family, you're embracing that archetype of the protector king in your home, right? So so in that sense, we generally get stuck on these Kantian ethics, and a lot of Christians do it. Well, it's, Jesus says, turn the other cheek, and this becomes for them like a Kantian universal that's applied. It's portable, and it's applied every situation for all times. And they can't see the nuance that's in a long history of Christian tradition that says, no, there is in a sinful world, there's a place for violence. There's different roles for different people, and there's different circumstances that then require you to step into and walk into these different archetypes. And so a lot of people misunderstand, both Christians and non-Christians, and unfortunately, oftentimes the nonviolent. I mean, there's a long tradition of nonviolence in the Christian faith, and there's a long tradition within the Christian faith of a more nuanced, what we would call the just war tradition, which is kind of a misnomer, but has a more nuanced understanding of violence in a sinful world. In post, it's official, it's personal. But I think a lot of times, if you think about it in terms of archetypes, it makes a lot more sense that way of what your choice might be in the moment. And so for me, in a sense, I think that a lot of the critiques of these young men that are saying, Christians don't lust for glory. Well, maybe they don't, but Christians are also capable of doing what's necessary in a sinful world when necessity demands it, when the circumstances demand that you step up and protect your people, when the circumstances or the role that God has given you demands that you punish the wrongdoer with violence, that you maintain order in your society with violence, that these things are then, you will be able to stand before God and then, to say and this is the blessings of grace that we have too, and to say that, yes, Lord, I know that this is not what you intended for your creation. This is the role that you put me, and I stand before you, I'm at your mercy and the grace of your Son, Jesus Christ, right? And so that's kind of the space that you walk in. It's a nuanced space, but I mean, again, Twitter doesn't love nuance, and a lot of people who are critical of the Christian faith in that regard, from, as I think it was you, whichever one of you said, that is that question, that lust for glory. I think they misunderstand the proper place for violence within the Christian tradition.